The year was 1914. Europe was a powder keg waiting for a spark. For decades, tensions had been building beneath a thin veneer of civilization. Imperial ambitions clashed. Ancient rivalries simmered. Military alliances crisscrossed the continent like tripwires, ready to detonate at the slightest provocation. And then it happened. A single gunshot in a forgotten corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. 2 bullets fired by a 19-year-old assassin would ignite the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. What began as a regional dispute between 2 small Balkan nations spiraled into a global catastrophe that would reshape the map of Europe, topple empires, and claim the lives of over 16 million people. This is the story of the Great War, the war to end all wars, World War I. But here's what most people don't understand about this conflict. It wasn't just one war. It was dozens of interconnected wars fought simultaneously across multiple continents. It was a war of empires and ideologies, a war that saw the birth of modern warfare and the death of the old world order. It was 4 years of unimaginable brutality that changed everything about how we fight, how we think, and how we remember. You think you know this story, but you don't. Not really, because what you learned in school was probably just dates and battles and generals with impressive mustaches. What you didn't learn was how a Serbian terrorist organization called the Black Hand nearly brought down Western civilization, how a German battle plan that was supposed to end the war in 6 weeks instead created 4 years of hell, how poison gas, machine guns, and barbed wire turned entire generations into ghosts. This isn't just history. This is the moment when the modern world was born in blood and mud. So buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into the chaos. We're going to follow this story from the first shot, fired in Sarajevo, to the last signature on the armistice papers. We're going to see how a single assassination cascaded into global catastrophe, how empires that had stood for centuries crumbled in a matter of years, how technology designed to protect humanity instead became its greatest threat. But first, we need to understand something crucial. The Great War didn't start in 1914. It started decades earlier, in the drawing rooms of European palaces and the war colleges of great powers. It started with a web of alliances so complex that even the diplomats who crafted them didn't fully understand the consequences. Let me paint you a picture of Europe in the early 20th century. Imagine a continent divided into armed camps, each side convinced of its own righteousness and terrified of the other's intentions. In one corner, you had the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, bound together by mutual defense treaties. In the other corner, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain, united by their shared fear of German expansion. These weren't just military alliances, they were insurance policies written in blood. If any member was attacked, the others were obligated to join the fight. It was supposed to keep the peace through deterrence. Instead, it guaranteed that any local conflict would become a continental war. At the center of this powder keg sat Germany, the new kid on the block. Unified only in 1871, Germany had rapidly become Europe's industrial powerhouse. Its steel production rivaled Britain's. Its army was the most efficient fighting force on the continent. Its Kaiser, Wilhelm II, had dreams of a German empire that would span the globe. But Germany was also paranoid. Surrounded by potential enemies, German military planners lived in constant fear of a two-front war. To the west lay France, still bitter about its defeat in 1870 and desperate to reclaim the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. To the east loomed Russia, a sleeping giant with an army of millions and ambitions in the Balkans that directly threatened German ally Austria-Hungary. This fear drove German strategy for decades. If war came, it had to be swift and decisive. Germany couldn't afford to fight France and Russia simultaneously, so they developed a plan. A brilliant, audacious, and ultimately catastrophic plan that would define the first months of the war. The Schlieffen Plan, named after the German general who conceived it, was elegantly simple in theory. When war broke out, Germany would ignore Russia initially, knowing that the Tsarist Empire's massive size would slow its mobilization. Instead, German forces would punch through neutral Belgium, sweep around Paris from the north, and knock France out of the war in 6 weeks. Then, with the Western Front secured, the entire German army would pivot east to deal with Russia. It was a gamble of enormous proportions. It required precise timing, flawless execution, and a bit of luck. Most importantly, it required that Britain stay neutral when Germany invaded Belgium. German planners dismissed the 1839 Treaty of London, which guaranteed Belgian neutrality, as just a scrap of paper. They couldn't have been more wrong. Meanwhile, France had its own plan, Plan 17th, called for an immediate offensive into Alsace-Lorraine, driven by the doctrine of élan vital, the belief that French fighting spirit and bayonet charges could overcome any obstacle. French generals, still fighting the wars of Napoleon in their minds, were convinced that offense was the key to victory. They had no idea what industrial warfare could do to men advancing in the open. Russia, for its part, was caught between its obligations to France and its own military limitations. The Russian Empire was vast but primitive. Its railway network was underdeveloped. Its officer corps was riddled with incompetence and corruption. Its soldiers were brave but poorly equipped. When war came, Russia would be expected to attack Germany immediately to relieve pressure on France, even though its army wouldn't be fully mobilized for months. And then there was Austria-Hungary, the empire that would inadvertently light the fuse. The dual monarchy was a patchwork of ethnicities, languages, and cultures held together by Habsburg tradition and bureaucratic inertia. Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Hungarians, Croatians, Serbs, Italians, and Germans all lived under the same crown, but harbored their own nationalist dreams. Nowhere were these tensions more dangerous than in the Balkans, where Slavic nationalism threatened to tear apart the southern reaches of the empire. Serbia, having gained independence from Ottoman rule, saw itself as the natural leader of all South Slavs. Many Serbs living within Austria-Hungary agreed. They wanted out of the empire and into a greater Serbian state. This was the world in 1914. A continent armed to the teeth, divided into opposing camps, and held together by a balance of terror that everyone knew was unsustainable. All it would take was one spark to set the whole thing ablaze. That spark came from the most unlikely of sources, a terrorist organization so obscure that most Europeans had never heard of it. The Black Hand, officially known as Unity or Death, was a secret society of Serbian military officers dedicated to the creation of a greater Serbia. They had already been involved in palace coups and political assassinations. Now they set their sights on a bigger target. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary made what would prove to be a fatal decision. He chose to visit Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, on the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, a date sacred to Serbian nationalism. It was either incredibly tone-deaf or breathtakingly arrogant, probably both. Franz Ferdinand wasn't just any Habsburg prince. He was the heir to the throne, next in line to rule over 50 million people across Central and Eastern Europe. He was also, ironically, one of the more liberal members of the imperial family. He had plans to transform the dual monarchy into a triple monarchy, giving the Slavs equal status with the Austrians and Hungarians. If successful, this reform might have diffused the very tensions that were driving men like the Black Hand conspirators to violence. But the conspirators didn't know about Franz Ferdinand's reform plans. All they saw was the symbol of Austrian oppression visiting their homeland on their most sacred day. It was an insult that demanded a response. The Black Hand had recruited a network of young Bosnian Serb students for the assassination attempt. These weren't hardened terrorists, but teenagers, barely out of school, filled with romantic notions about martyrdom and liberation. They had been given bombs, pistols, and cyanide capsules, the latter to ensure they wouldn't be taken alive. On that Sunday morning, as Franz Ferdinand's motorcade made its way through Sarajevo's narrow streets, the first assassination attempt failed spectacularly. A conspirator named Nedeljko Čabrinović threw his bomb at the Archduke's car, but it bounced off and exploded under the following vehicle, injuring several officers, but leaving Franz Ferdinand unharmed. In the chaos that followed, most of the conspirators lost their nerve and melted away into the crowd. The assassination seemed to have failed. Franz Ferdinand, shaken but determined to continue his visit, decided to go to the hospital to visit the wounded officers. It was an act of decency that would cost him his life. But here's where the story takes a turn that seems almost too incredible to be true. The Archduke's driver, unfamiliar with Sarajevo's streets, took a wrong turn. Realizing his mistake, he stopped the car and began to reverse, directly in front of a delicatessen where 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip was standing, probably wondering how the day's great mission had gone so wrong. Princip couldn't believe his luck. The target he had travelled from Belgrade to kill was sitting motionless just 5 feet away. He stepped forward, drew his pistol, and fired 2 shots. The first hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The second struck his wife Sophie in the abdomen. Both would be dead within minutes. In that moment, as the Archduke's blood spread across his military uniform and his wife's white dress, the old world began to die. Those 2 bullets, fired by a teenage revolutionary who probably couldn't have imagined the consequences, set in motion a chain of events that would destroy 4 empires, redraw the map of Europe, and introduce humanity to the industrial machinery of death. But here's the thing that most people miss about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. It didn't immediately trigger World War I. The war began not because of what happened in Sarajevo, but because of how the great powers chose to respond to what happened in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary could have treated the assassination as a criminal matter. They could have demanded that Serbia investigate and prosecute the conspirators. They could have used diplomacy to address their legitimate grievances about terrorism emanating from Serbian territory. Instead, they chose to see the assassination as an opportunity to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all, an opportunity to restore Habsburg prestige in the Balkans, an opportunity to show the world that the dual monarchy was still a great power to be reckoned with. But Austria-Hungary couldn't move against Serbia without backup. Russia had positioned itself as the protector of all Slavs, and any Austrian attack on Serbia would likely bring Russian intervention. So Austrian leaders travelled to Berlin to secure German support for whatever action they might take. What they received was far more than they had dared to hope for. Kaiser Wilhelm, outraged by the assassination of a fellow monarch, gave Austria-Hungary what historians call the blank check, unconditional German support for any action against Serbia, even if it meant war with Russia. This was the moment when a regional crisis became a continental catastrophe. With German backing assured, Austria-Hungary began preparing an ultimatum to Serbia so harsh that no self-respecting nation could accept it. The goal wasn't negotiation, it was humiliation followed by war. The ultimatum that Austria-Hungary delivered to Serbia on July 23rd was a masterpiece of diplomatic aggression disguised as legal procedure. It wasn't just demanding justice for the assassination. It was demanding the complete surrender of Serbian sovereignty. The terms were breathtaking in their scope. Serbia would have to suppress all anti-Austrian publications and organizations. They would have to dismiss any government officials that Austria deemed objectionable. They would have to allow Austrian police and judges to operate on Serbian soil to investigate the assassination. Most humiliatingly, they would have to let Austrian officials participate directly in the prosecution of anyone connected to the plot. It was designed to be rejected. Austria-Hungary wanted war, not justice. They wanted to settle the South Slav question with bullets and artillery shells, not lawyers and diplomats. But here's where the story gets interesting. Serbia, against all expectations, agreed to almost everything. Almost. They accepted the demands to suppress anti-Austrian activities, to dismiss objectionable officials, even to cooperate in the investigation. But they drew the line at allowing Austrian officials to operate on Serbian territory. That, they said, would violate their constitution and their sovereignty. Any reasonable nation would have seen Serbia's response as a diplomatic victory. They had gotten 90% of what they demanded. But Austria-Hungary wasn't interested in being reasonable. They had already mobilized their army. Their German allies were expecting action. The machinery of war was already in motion. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The first shots of what would become the Great War were fired by Austrian gunboats on the Danube River, shelling Belgrade while civilians fled in panic through the streets. But this was still just a regional war. Serbia was a small country with a small army. Austria-Hungary was a great power with millions of soldiers. Under normal circumstances, it would have been over in weeks. The problem was that circumstances were anything but normal. Russia couldn't abandon Serbia without losing all credibility as the protector of Slavic peoples. Tsar Nicholas II, despite his personal reluctance to go to war, found himself trapped by his own rhetoric and his nation's strategic interests. If Austria-Hungary crushed Serbia, Russian influence in the Balkans would collapse. The Ottoman Empire, already the sick man of Europe, would fall completely under German and Austrian control. Russia would be cut off from the Mediterranean and reduced to a second-rate power. So Russia began to mobilize, not just against Austria-Hungary, but against Germany as well. Russian military planners, like their German counterparts, believed that modern war required total commitment. You couldn't mobilize against one enemy and ignore their allies. It was all or nothing. Germany watched Russian mobilization with growing alarm. The Schlieffen Plan required that Germany attack France before Russia could fully mobilize its massive army. Every day of delay meant that millions more Russian soldiers would be armed, equipped, and ready for battle. If Germany waited too long, they would face exactly the two-front war that their entire strategy was designed to avoid. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. The Localcan conflict Balbekam had just a European war, but it still wasn't a world war. Not yet. France found itself caught in the middle of a nightmare scenario. They were bound by treaty to support Russia against Germany, but they had hoped that diplomacy might still prevent a general European war. Those hopes died when German forces began massing on the Belgian border. The Schlieffen Plan was finally being put into action. German armies, over 1 million strong, were preparing to sweep through neutral Belgium and into France. It was the moment that British policymakers had been dreading for decades. A German army in control of the Belgian coast would threaten British naval supremacy and put German artillery within range of London. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality in 1839. For 75 years, that guarantee had been theoretical. Now it became the most important piece of paper in European diplomacy. When Germany invaded Belgium on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. The European war had just become a world war. But here's what makes this escalation so tragic and so avoidable. None of the leaders who made these decisions really wanted a general European war. Kaiser Wilhelm had second thoughts about the blank check and tried to pull Austria-Hungary back from the brink. Tsar Nicholas exchanged desperate telegrams with his cousin Wilhelm, both men hoping to find a peaceful solution. Even the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ruled for 66 years and seen enough war to last several lifetimes, seemed shocked by the speed with which events spiraled out of control. But by early August, the momentum of mobilization had taken on a life of its own. Millions of men were being loaded onto trains and shipped toward the frontiers. Railway timetables had become more important than diplomatic negotiations. Military planners who had spent decades preparing for this moment weren't about to let politicians spoil their carefully laid plans. The generals had convinced themselves that war was inevitable, and that the side that struck first would have an insurmountable advantage. They were half right. War had indeed become inevitable once the mobilization orders were given, but the idea that quick action would lead to quick victory was about to be shattered by the reality of modern warfare. As German armies poured into Belgium, they expected to encounter token resistance from a small, poorly equipped force. Belgian forts would fall within hours. The roads to France would be open within days. The Schlieffen Plan would unfold like clockwork. Instead, they ran into a buzzsaw. The Belgians fought with a ferocity that stunned the German high command. Forts that were supposed to surrender after a few hours of bombardment held out for days or even weeks. Belgian civilians, enraged by the invasion of their neutral country, took up arms against the occupiers. German supply lines, stretched across hostile territory, came under constant attack. The German response was swift and brutal. Convinced that they were facing an organized civilian uprising, German commanders authorized their troops to take whatever measures were necessary to pacify the population. Villages were burned. Civilians were executed en masse. The ancient library of Louvain, with its priceless collection of medieval manuscripts, was put to the torch. The Rape of Belgium, as it came to be known, shocked the civilized world. Here was proof that the German army, despite its reputation for discipline and professionalism, was capable of medieval brutality. British propaganda seized on German atrocities in Belgium to justify their entry into the war. The Germans weren't just threatening British interests, they were threatening civilization itself. Meanwhile, the French were implementing their own disastrous battle plan. Plan 17 called for an immediate offensive into Alsace-Lorraine, the provinces lost to Germany in 1870. French generals, intoxicated by theories about the power of offensive spirit, sent wave after wave of soldiers charging across open fields into German machine gun nests. The results were catastrophic. French soldiers, dressed in bright blue coats and red trousers that made them perfect targets, were cut down by the thousands. In a single day at the Battle of the Frontiers, France lost 27,000 men killed, more than they had lost in any single day during the entire Franco-Prussian War. But the worst was yet to come. While French forces were bleeding themselves white in futile attacks on prepared German positions, the main German army was sweeping through Belgium toward Paris. By late August, German forces were only 30 miles from the French capital. The government fled to Bordeaux. Military commanders prepared to defend the city street by street. And then, just when it seemed that the Schlieffen Plan might succeed after all, something unexpected happened. The German advance slowed, then stopped, then began to retreat. The miracle of the Marne, as it came to be known, saved Paris and changed the entire character of the war. What went wrong with the Schlieffen Plan? Almost everything. The Belgian resistance had delayed the German advance by crucial days. The longer supply lines stretched German logistics to the breaking point. French and British forces, though battered, had not been destroyed and were regrouping for a counterattack. Most importantly, the German High Command had lost its nerve. General Helmuth von Moltke, the architect of Germany's war plan, began pulling troops away from the crucial right wing to reinforce other sectors. The great sweeping movement supposed to NC that was Expo-Zirkel Paris, instead the German flank to counterattack. The Battle of the Marne, fought from September 6th to 12th, marked the end of the war of movement and the beginning of something far more terrible. Both sides, exhausted by weeks of marching and fighting, began digging trenches to hold their positions. What started as temporary defensive measures became permanent fortifications stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The Western Front had been born, and with it, a new kind of warfare that would define the next 4 years. Static, brutal, and seemingly endless. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas had instead become a siege on a continental scale. But the failure of the Schlieffen Plan had consequences far beyond the Western Front. With their quick victory denied, Germany was now fighting exactly the two-front war they had hoped to avoid. In the east, Russian forces were already crossing the German border, threatening to overrun East Prussia, while the bulk of the German army was tied down in France. The stage was set for a global conflict unlike anything the world had ever seen. What had begun as a dispute between Austria-Hungary and Serbia had metastasized into a war between the great powers of Europe. Soon it would spread to Africa, the Middle East, and the high seas. Empires would mobilize their colonies, new technologies would be unleashed, and millions of young men would march off to a war that would consume everything they thought they knew about civilization, honor, and human nature. The Great War had begun, but nobody yet understood what they had unleashed. The trenches were supposed to be temporary. Just a few weeks of defensive positions, while both sides regrouped and planned their next offensive. Nobody imagined they would become permanent scars across the face of Europe, stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps. Nobody envisioned that these hastily dug ditches would become the defining symbol of an entire generation's nightmare. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had stabilized into a deadly stalemate. Two massive armies faced each other across a strip of devastated earth called No Man's Land. Between them lay a maze of barbed wire, shell craters, and the unburied dead. It was a wound in the earth that would fester for 4 years. But here's what you need to understand about trench warfare. It wasn't just about the trenches themselves. It was an entire system of underground cities. Front-line trenches were connected by communication trenches that zigzagged back to reserve supply trenches, then to artillery positions miles behind the lines. Some of these trench systems went down 3 or 4 levels, with underground hospitals, ammunition dumps, and command centers carved out of the earth. Living in these trenches was like existing in a man-made hell. The smell hit you first, a nauseating cocktail of human waste, rotting corpses, poison gas, and unwashed bodies. Then came the rats. Enormous rats, grown fat on human flesh, that would run across sleeping soldiers and steal food from their hands. The lice were worse, tiny vampires that burrowed into every piece of clothing and drove men to madness with their constant itching. And then there was trench foot. Your boots would fill with water and stay wet for weeks. Your feet would swell, turn white, then black. The skin would peel off in sheets. In severe cases, toes would simply rot away. Soldiers would stuff their boots with newspaper, grease their feet with whale oil, anything to keep the moisture out. Nothing worked. But the physical conditions were nothing compared to the psychological torture. Imagine living for months knowing that at any moment a sniper's bullet could end your life, that a shell could land directly in your trench and obliterate you and everyone around you, that your next order might be to climb out of your protective hole and charge across open ground into machine gun fire. The artillery was the worst part, not just because it killed more men than any other weapon, though it did, accounting for over 60% of all casualties. It was the psychological effect that broke men's minds, the constant thunder of guns, sometimes lasting for days without pause. The earth shaking beneath your feet. The scream of incoming shells that you could hear for 30 seconds before impact. 30 seconds to wonder if this was the one with your name on it. They called it shell shock then. We call it PTSD now. Men would develop uncontrollable tremors, lose the ability to speak, or simply curl up in a ball and refuse to move. Military doctors didn't understand it. Some thought it was cowardice. Others believed it was caused by the physical concussion of exploding shells. They tried everything from electric shock therapy to hypnosis. Nothing worked because they didn't understand that you can't cure trauma with more trauma. The generals, safe in their headquarters miles behind the lines, couldn't comprehend why their carefully planned offensives kept failing. On paper, it seemed simple. Bombard the enemy trenches with artillery for hours or days, destroying their barbed wire and killing their defenders. Then send waves of infantry across no man's land to occupy the enemy positions. Clean, efficient, scientific. In reality, it was mass suicide with extra steps. The problem was that military thinking hadn't caught up with military technology. Generals were still planning Napoleonic battles with industrial weapons. They believed that sufficient courage and sufficient numbers could overcome any obstacle. They were catastrophically wrong. Machine guns had changed everything. A single gun, operated by 2 men, could fire 600 rounds per minute. It could cut down an entire company of attacking soldiers in less time than it took to read this paragraph. And the Germans, masters of defensive warfare, had perfected the art of interlocking fields of fire. Attack one machine gun position, and 2 others would cut you down from the flanks. Artillery had evolved too. The old cannons that fired solid cannonballs in neat arcs had been replaced by howitzers that lobbed high-explosive shells in high trajectories. These new shells didn't just punch holes in things, they vaporized them. A direct hit from a heavy shell could erase a man so completely that nothing remained but a red mist. But perhaps the most terrifying innovation was poison gas. It started almost by accident. The Germans, desperate to break the stalemate, began experimenting with chemical weapons in early 1915. The first gas attack at Ypres used chlorine, released from pressurized cylinders when the wind was blowing toward enemy lines. The effect was immediate and horrific. A yellow-green cloud drifted across no man's land and into the Allied trenches. Men began choking, gasping for air that wasn't there, their lungs filled with fluid. They drowned on dry land, their faces turning blue, their bodies convulsing in agony. But gas was a double-edged sword. It depended on wind direction, which could change without warning. More one attack than was ruined when the wind shifted and blew the gas back onto the attackers. Both sides quickly developed gas masks, turning soldiers into insect-like creatures with bulging glass eyes and rubber snouts. The gas evolved too. Chlor-iron gave way to phosgene, which was harder to detect and more deadly. Then came mustard gas, which didn't just attack the lungs but burned the skin and caused temporary or permanent blindness. It could linger in shell craters for weeks, an invisible death trap for anyone unlucky enough to step into it. And yet, despite all these innovations in killing, the front lines barely moved. Battles that cost hundreds of thousands of lives might gain a few hundred yards of worthless muddy ground. The Battle of Verdun, fought throughout 1916, cost over 700,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. And when it was over, the lines were almost exactly where they had started. Verdun became a symbol of French determination. They declare shall not pass to General Philippe Pétain, and somehow, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, they didn't. The battle consumed entire divisions like a hungry monster. Men were fed into the meat grinder and emerged as statistics. But France held. The Battle of the Somme, fought by the British that same year, was even worse. On the first day alone, July 1st, 1916, the British suffered 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead. It was the bloodiest single day in British military history, and that was just the beginning. The battle raged for 4 months, ultimately costing over 1 million casualties for an advance of just 7 miles. Why did the generals keep ordering these hopeless attacks? Because they didn't know what else to do. This was unprecedented warfare, and everyone was making it up as they went along. The doctrine of the offensive, drilled into military academies for decades, said that attack was the key to victory. Defense was passive, cowardly, unmilitary. But industrial technology had made defense dominant. A man in a trench with a rifle could hold off 10 men attacking across open ground. Add machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire, and the advantage became overwhelming. Yet the generals kept believing that one more push, one more bombardment, one more wave of brave young men would break through and restore the war of movement. They were wrong, and their wrongness was measured in graveyards. The soldiers knew it was hopeless, but they went anyway, not because they believed in the cause, though many did, at least initially, but because they had no choice. Desertion was punishable by death. Cowardice in the face of the enemy meant a firing squad. And besides, where could you run? The war had consumed everything. There was nowhere to hide from it, so they developed their own culture of survival. Dark humor became a defense mechanism. They wrote songs about the rats and the lice, turned their misery into comedy because the alternative was madness. They formed bonds with their fellow soldiers that were stronger than family, because these men were the only ones who truly understood what they were going through. They also developed a healthy cynicism about their leaders. The phrase, "lions led by donkeys," captured the growing resentment toward generals who ordered attacks from the safety of chateaux 20 miles behind the lines. The soldiers could see that their officers, for all their medals and fancy uniforms, had no idea what they were doing. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed an unofficial system of live and let live. In quiet sectors of the front, where no major operations were planned, both sides would settle into a routine of minimal aggression. Artillery barrages would be carefully timed to avoid mealtimes. Snipers would aim to miss. Patrols would make noise to warn the other side they were coming. This informal truce was periodically shattered by orders from above to maintain aggressive patrolling or dominate no man's land. Fresh officers, eager to prove themselves, would order raids that served no strategic purpose but got good men killed. The veterans learned to hate these newcomers almost as much as they hated the enemy. As 1914 turned to 1915, then 1916, then 1917, the war took on a life of its own. It became a machine that consumed men, money, and material at an unprecedented rate. Entire economies were reorganized to feed the monster. Factories that once made cars now produced artillery shells. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers to replace the men who had gone to fight. The home front became almost as militarized as the actual front. Governments took control of food distribution, transportation, and information. Propaganda became a weapon as important as artillery. Every citizen was expected to contribute to the war effort, to buy war bonds, to grow victory gardens, to report suspicious behavior. And still, the war continued. The Schlieffen Plan had failed, but Germany couldn't admit defeat. Too much had been invested, too many men had died, too much pride was at stake. They would try new strategies, new weapons, new allies, anything to avoid the humiliation of surrender. The Allies were trapped in the same logic. They couldn't accept a negotiated peace that left Germany in control of Belgium and northern France. Too much blood had been spilled to settle for anything less than total victory. So they too would try new approaches, new technologies, new ways to break the deadlock. But breaking the deadlock would require more than new tactics or weapons. It would require the entry of new players into the game, powers that could tip the balance decisively in one direction or another. The war that had begun as a European conflict was about to become truly global. In the East, Russia was already showing signs of strain. The Tsarist Empire had mobilized millions of men, but it lacked the industrial capacity to arm and supply them properly. Russian soldiers were fighting with obsolete rifles, inadequate artillery, and insufficient ammunition. Their transportation system was breaking down under the strain of moving men and supplies across vast distances. Worse, the Russian officer corps St. Anne was riddled with incompetent corruption. Many positions were filled by aristocrats who had purchased their commissions rather than earned them through merit. They treated their men like serfs, and the men responded with sullen resentment that occasionally erupted into mutiny. The Germans, despite being outnumbered on the Eastern Front, had won a series of devastating victories against the Russians. The battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes had destroyed entire Russian armies and made heroes of German generals like Hindenburg and Ludendorff. By 1917, Russia was teetering on the edge of collapse. But if Russia dropped out of the war, Germany could transfer millions of troops from the Eastern to the Western Front. The balance of power would shift decisively in Germany's favor. The Allies needed a new ally, and they needed one fast. That ally would come from across the Atlantic. The United States had been neutral since the war began, despite having cultural and economic ties to Britain. President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned for re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war," but keeping America out of the war was becoming increasingly difficult. German submarines had been attacking American ships since the war began. The sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania in 1915, with the loss of over 1,000 civilian lives, including 128 Americans, had caused outrage across the United States. Germany had backed down temporarily, but by 1917, they were desperate enough to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. The decision to unleash their submarines was Germany's last roll of the dice. They calculated that they could starve Britain into submission before America could mobilize and ship a significant army across the Atlantic. It was a reasonable calculation based on the evidence available. It was also completely wrong. The final straw came in the form of a telegram. The Zimmermann telegram, intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, revealed a German plot to ally with Mexico against the United States. In exchange for Mexican support, Germany promised to help Mexico reconquer the southwestern United States, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the telegram was published in American newspapers, it caused a sensation. The idea of German agents plotting on American soil, of Mexican armies marching into Texas, of the Kaiser's forces operating in the Western Hemisphere. It was too much for American public opinion to bear. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The entry of the world's largest industrial power into the conflict would ultimately decide the war's outcome. But that outcome was still more than a year away. And in the meantime, the killing would continue on a scale that defied comprehension. The Great War had become exactly what its architects had hoped to avoid, a prolonged struggle of attrition in which victory would go not to the most skilled or the most brave, but to whichever side could endure the longest. It was a test of entire nations' willingness to sacrifice their young men on the altar of national pride. And the altar was hungry for more. The entry of America into the war should have been the beginning of the end for Germany. Fresh troops, unlimited industrial capacity, and the moral authority of fighting for democracy. It seemed like the perfect combination to tip the scales decisively in favor of the Allies. But here's what nobody anticipated. It would take over a year for American forces to make any meaningful impact on the battlefield. America in 1917 was a sleeping giant with a tiny military. The entire United States Army numbered only 200,000 men, smaller than the forces that Britain had lost in a single day at the Somme. American generals had experience fighting Native Americans and Spanish colonial forces, but they had no idea how to conduct industrial warfare against the most professional army in the world. The Americans would have to learn everything from scratch: how to mass-produce artillery shells, how to train millions of civilian soldiers, how to transport enormous armies across submarine-infested waters, how to coordinate with allies who spoke different languages and had fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Meanwhile, Germany was presented with a golden opportunity. If they could win the war before American forces arrived in significant numbers, they might still salvage victory from what increasingly looked like defeat. But to do that, they needed to knock either Britain or France out of the war quickly, and that meant taking enormous risks. The risk they chose was revolutionary warfare. Not the kind fought with guns and artillery, but the kind fought with ideas. German intelligence had been watching the growing unrest in Russia with keen interest. The Tsarist regime was rotting from within. Food shortages were causing riots in major cities. Military defeats had destroyed what little confidence the people still had in their government. All it needed was a push. That push came in the form of a sealed train, carrying a cargo more dangerous than any explosive. Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik revolutionaries, transported from Swiss exile through German territory to the Russian border. The Germans calculated that Lenin's radical ideas would spread chaos through Russian society and force Russia out of the war. They were right, though they had no idea what monster they were unleashing upon the world. The Russian Revolution didn't happen overnight. It began in March 1917 with bread riots in Petrograd that spiraled into a general uprising against Tsar Nicholas II. The army, ordered to fire on the crowds, instead joined them. Within a week, a dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries had collapsed, but the provisional government that replaced the Tsar made a fatal mistake. They decided to continue fighting in the war, hoping that military victory would legitimize their rule and unite the country behind them. Instead, it played directly into the hands of Lenin and his radical followers, who promised peace, land, and bread to a war-weary population. The Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917 in what they called the October Revolution. The discrepancy in dates due to Russia still using the old Julian calendar. Their first act was to begin negotiations for a separate peace with Germany. By March 1918, Russia was officially out of the war, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that handed over enormous territories to German control. Germany's gamble had paid off spectacularly. The Eastern Front, which had tied down millions of German soldiers for 3 years, was now closed. Those troops could be transferred west for one final, decisive offensive against Britain and France, before American forces could intervene in meaningful numbers. But the Germans had made a crucial miscalculation. They assumed that the Western Allies were as exhausted and demoralized as the Russians had been. They were wrong. France had been bled white at Verdun, but it hadn't broken. Britain had lost the flower of its youth on the Somme, but it was still fighting. And now both nations could see the light at the end of the tunnel. American divisions were beginning to arrive in Europe, fresh-faced doughboys who hadn't spent 3 years in the trenches. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 was their last chance to win the war. General Erich Ludendorff, now effectively the military dictator of Germany, planned a series of massive attacks designed to split the British and French armies and capture Paris before American reinforcements could stop them. The offensive began on March 21st with the largest artillery bombardment in human history. Over 6,000 guns opened fire simultaneously along a 50-mile front, raining shells down on British positions for 5 hours. The sound could be heard in London, 200 miles away. Then came something new: elite German stormtroopers, specially trained in infiltration tactics, who bypassed strong points and penetrated deep into enemy territory. For the first time since 1914, the Western Front was mobile again. German forces advanced up to 40 miles in some sectors, overrunning positions that had been static for years. British forces fell back in disorder. French reserves rushed north to plug the gaps. For a few terrifying weeks, it looked like the Schlieffen Plan might finally succeed, 4 years too late. But the German advance was running on borrowed time. The stormtroopers who led the attack were Germany's best soldiers, and they were taking heavy casualties that couldn't be replaced. The German army was advancing into a logistical nightmare, moving away from their supply bases and into territory that had been systematically destroyed by years of warfare. More importantly, American forces were now arriving at a rate of 250,000 men per month. These weren't the hesitant, unprepared troops that had first landed in France. A year of training had transformed American civilian soldiers into a formidable fighting force. They were well-fed, well-equipped, and most importantly, they hadn't spent 3 years being ground down by trench warfare. The German offensive stalled, then stopped, then began to retreat. By summer 1918, it was clear that Germany's last gamble had failed. The Allies launched their own offensive, spearheaded by fresh American divisions and supported by new weapons that were finally catching up with the realities of modern warfare. Tanks had evolved from the slow, unreliable monsters of 1916 into fast, effective weapons of breakthrough. Aircraft had developed from flimsy reconnaissance platforms into fighters and bombers that could dominate the skies above the battlefield. Most importantly, the Allies had learned how to coordinate infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft into combined arms offensives that could punch through any defensive line. The German army, exhausted by 4 years of war and deprived of its best men, began to disintegrate. Discipline broke down. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. Desertion became epidemic. The home front was collapsing too. German civilians were literally starving due to the British naval blockade, surviving on turnips and ersatz coffee made from acorns. But it wasn't just Germany that was falling apart. The entire old order of European civilization was cracking under the strain. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was disintegrating as its various nationalities declared independence. The Ottoman Empire was being carved up by Arab revolts and British offensives. Even the victorious Allies were exhausted, their societies transformed by 4 years of total war. The influenza pandemic of 1918 was the final blow. This wasn't ordinary seasonal flu, it was a killer virus that struck down healthy young adults in their prime. It spread like wildfire through the crowded military camps and troop transports, killing more people than the war itself. Some estimates put the death toll at over 50 million worldwide, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The flu hit both sides equally, but Germany was less able to cope with the additional strain. Their medical system was already overwhelmed by military casualties. Their population was weakened by malnutrition. Their government was losing control of the country as revolutions spread from the ports to the cities to the countryside. By November 1918, it was over. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. A new German government, desperate to stop the killing, agreed to an armistice. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent along the Western Front. The Great War was over, but its consequences were just beginning. 4 empires had collapsed. Millions were dead or displaced. The map of Europe had been redrawn. New nations were being born while old ones struggled to survive. And in the ruins of the old world, new ideologies were taking root that would shape the rest of the 20th century. The soldiers who survived would spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of what they had experienced. Many couldn't. They had seen civilization collapse into barbarism, had witnessed the industrial machinery of death reduce human beings to statistics. They had been promised that this would be the war to end all wars, but they suspected it was really just the beginning of something far worse. They were right. The peace treaty signed at Versailles in 1919 didn't resolve the issues that had caused the war. It simply rearranged them. Germany was humiliated, but not destroyed, left with a burning sense of injustice that would fuel future conflicts. Russia was consumed by civil war and revolutionary terror. The victorious democracies were exhausted and divided. Within 20 years, the world would be at war again. The second global conflict would be even more devastating than the first, and many of its roots could be traced back to the unfinished business of 1918. The Great War hadn't ended all wars. It had simply shown the world how much more terrible war could become. But that's a story for another time. For now, as we look back across more than a century at the ruins of that first global catastrophe, we can see the moment when the modern world was born. It was born in the trenches of the Western Front, in the gas clouds of Ypres, in the shell craters of Verdun. It was born in revolution and pandemic, in the collapse of empires and the rise of new powers. The world of 1914, that confident, optimistic world of kings and colonies and unquestioned progress, died somewhere in the mud of no man's land. What emerged from the wreckage was our world, uncertain, traumatized, but perhaps a little wiser about the true cost of war. The armistice bells were ringing across Europe, but the silence they announced was deceptive. November 11th, 1918, wasn't really an ending. It was a pause between catastrophes. The Great War had officially ended, but its ghosts would haunt the world for decades to come. Picture this scene. In railway cars, hospital wards, and refugee camps across the continent, millions of people were trying to piece together what remained of their lives. Soldiers who had spent 4 years in hell were returning to homes that no longer existed. Women who had run factories and farms were being told to return to their kitchens. Children who had never known peace were trying to imagine what normal life might look like. But here's the thing that nobody talks about when they discuss the end of World War I. The war didn't really end in 1918. It fragmented. It metastasized. It spread like a virus into every corner of European society, creating new conflicts, new resentments, new reasons to fight. The Versailles Peace Conference that opened in January 1919 was supposed to create a lasting peace. Instead, it created the blueprint for the next war. The Big Four, Wilson from America, Lloyd George from Britain, Clemenceau from France, and Orlando from Italy, gathered in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the same room where the German Empire had been proclaimed nearly 50 years earlier. The symbolism was intentional and brutal. These men thought they were rebuilding the world. They were actually dismantling it piece by piece. Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris as a messianic figure, preaching his 14 points and his vision of a League of Nations that would make war obsolete. He believed in self-determination, in democracy, in the power of international law to solve disputes. He was an idealist in a room full of pragmatists, and they ate him alive. Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister known as the Tiger, had spent 4 years watching German armies destroy his country. He had seen French villages erased from the map, French cathedrals reduced to rubble, French boys fed into the meat grinder of trench warfare. He didn't want justice, he wanted revenge. He wanted Germany so thoroughly crushed that it could never threaten France again. David Lloyd George walked a tightrope between Wilson's idealism and Clemenceau's vengeance. Britain had won the war, but at enormous cost. The British Empire was straining under the financial burden of 4 years of total war. Lloyd George needed a peace that would preserve British interests without bankrupting the empire, or creating so much instability that another war became inevitable. And then there was Germany, the elephant in the room that wasn't actually in the room. The Germans weren't invited to participate in the peace negotiations. They were summoned to Versailles in May 1919 to receive their sentence, not to help craft it. When they saw the terms, they were stunned. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just punish Germany, it humiliated it. Germany lost 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. The Rhineland would be occupied by Allied troops for 15 years. The German military was reduced to 100,000 men, barely larger than a police force. Germany was forbidden from having tanks, aircraft, or submarines. Most devastating of all, Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war and all its damages. But the cruelest blow was the reparations. Germany would have to pay for the entire cost of the war, not just the damage to property, but pensions for Allied veterans, compensation for civilian suffering, even the interest on loans that the Allies had taken out to finance their war effort. The final bill, set in 1921, was 132 billion gold marks, roughly $33 billion, or about $500 billion in today's money. It was an impossible sum. Germany's entire annual economic output before the war had been only $12 billion. Even if Germany devoted every penny of its national income to reparations, leaving nothing for food, housing, or any other human need, it would take decades to pay off the debt. The German delegation protested that the terms violated Wilson's 14 points, which had formed the basis of the armistice agreement. They argued that the reparations would destroy the German economy and create conditions for revolution or another war. They were ignored. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, German representatives signed the treaty under protest. As they signed, Clemenceau reportedly muttered, "This is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. He was off by exactly 65 days. But Versailles was just the beginning. The peacemakers had to redraw the map of an entire continent. 4 empires had collapsed: German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, leaving a power vacuum that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Persian Gulf. Out of the wreckage of Austria-Hungary came a bewildering array of new nations. Czechoslovakia was created from Czech and Slovak territories, despite the fact that Czechs and Slovaks had different languages, different histories, and different ideas about their future. Yugoslavia was cobbled together from Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian, and Bosnian territories, ignoring centuries of ethnic and religious conflict. Poland was perhaps the most complex case. The new Polish state was carved out of German, Austrian, and Russian territories, creating a nation with borders that satisfied nobody. The Polish corridor, which gave Poland access to the sea, cut East Prussia off from the rest of Germany, a geographic absurdity that would have profound consequences 20 years later. Hungary was reduced to a rump state, losing 2/3 of its territory and population. Millions of ethnic Hungarians found themselves living in Romania, Czechoslovakia, or Yugoslavia, creating irredentist movements that would destabilize the region for decades. In the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire created an entirely new set of problems. The British and French carved up the former Ottoman territories between them, creating artificial states like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon that bore no relationship to ethnic, religious, or tribal realities on the ground. The most controversial decision was the Balfour Declaration, which promised British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This wasn't just a diplomatic statement. It was the planting of a seed that would grow into one of the world's most intractable conflicts. But perhaps the most ominous consequence of the war's end was what happened in Russia. The Bolsheviks had won their civil war by 1921, consolidating control over most of the former Russian Empire. Under Lenin and later Stalin, the Soviet Union would become a totalitarian state that made the old Tsarist autocracy look benign by comparison. The Russian Revolution wasn't just a change of government. It was the birth of a new ideology that would challenge the entire Western world order. Communism promised to create a classless society through violent revolution. It rejected democracy, capitalism, and individual rights in favor of collective ownership and party dictatorship. The Western powers had tried to strangle the Bolshevik regime in its cradle, sending troops to support the White Armies during the Russian Civil War. They failed, and their intervention left the Soviet Union with a permanent sense of encirclement and paranoia. The stage was set for the Cold War, even though it wouldn't begin in earnest for another quarter century. Meanwhile, in Germany, the new Weimar Republic was struggling to survive. The government that had signed the armistice was blamed for Germany's defeat. The November criminals, who had supposedly stabbed Germany in the back just as victory was within reach. It was a lie, but it was a politically useful lie that would be exploited by extremists on both the left and the right. The German economy collapsed under the weight of reparations payments and post-war dislocation. By 1923, hyperinflation had made German currency worthless. People needed wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. Life savings were wiped out overnight. The middle class, the backbone of German democracy, was destroyed. In this chaos, extremist movements flourished. Communist revolutionaries tried to seize power in several German states. Right-wing paramilitaries fought running battles with left-wing militias in the streets. And in a Munich beer hall in 1923, a failed Austrian painter named Adolf Hitler attempted his first grab for power. The beer hall putsch failed, and Hitler was arrested and tried for treason. But his trial became a platform for his message of German victimization and racial superiority. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served less than 1. While incarcerated, he wrote the first volume of Mein Kampf, laying out his vision of a racially pure German empire that would dominate Europe for 1,000 years. Most people dismissed Hitler as a lunatic. The German people, they believed, were too educated, too civilized, too democratic to fall for such crude appeals to hatred and revenge. They were catastrophically wrong. The seeds of the next war were being planted in the soil of the last one's aftermath. Every humiliation inflicted by the Versailles Treaty created a grievance that could be exploited. Every arbitrary border drawn by the peacemakers created a minority population that could be liberated. Every economic crisis created desperation that could be channeled into political extremism. But it wasn't just Germany that was radicalized by the war's aftermath. Italy, despite being on the winning side, felt cheated by the peace settlement. Promised territorial gains in the Adriatic had been denied. The economy was in ruins. Returning veterans couldn't find work. In this environment, Benito Mussolini's fascist movement found fertile ground. Mussolini had figured out something important about post-war politics. People didn't just want bread, they wanted meaning. They wanted to feel that their sacrifices had been worthwhile, that their nation was destined for greatness. Fascism offered both, a promise of economic revival wrapped in the rhetoric of national rebirth. By 1922, Mussolini was in power in Italy, having marched on Rome with his black-shirted followers. He established the first fascist dictatorship in Europe, providing a model that would be copied across the continent. Democracy, it seemed, was a luxury that war-exhausted societies could no longer afford. The influenza pandemic that had killed more people than the war itself was finally burning out by 1920, but its effects lingered. Entire families had been wiped out. Communities had been devastated. The psychological impact of losing loved ones to an invisible enemy, after 4 years of losing them to a visible one, was almost unbearable. Add to this the millions of war widows, orphans, and disabled veterans, and you begin to understand the scale of the social catastrophe that Europe faced in the 1920s. Traditional support systems, families, churches, communities, had been shattered. Governments struggled to provide adequate care for those who had sacrificed everything for their countries. The lost generation of writers and artists captured this sense of disillusionment and spiritual emptiness. Ernest Hemingway, who had served as an ambulance driver on the Italian front, wrote about characters who had lost their faith in traditional values. Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front showed the war from the perspective of German soldiers, revealing that suffering and disillusionment weren't limited to one side. These works weren't just literature. They were therapy for entire societies trying to process trauma on an unprecedented scale. They helped people understand that they weren't alone in their feelings of loss and confusion, that an entire generation was struggling to find meaning in a world that seemed to have gone insane. The economic consequences of the war extended far beyond Germany's reparations payments. The entire global financial system had been disrupted. Britain, which had financed much of the Allied war effort, was deeply in debt to the United States. France needed reparations from Germany to pay back its debts to Britain and America. It was a house of cards that would collapse spectacularly in 1929. But even before the Great Depression, the world economy was struggling with the aftermath of 4 years of total war. Currencies were unstable. Trade patterns had been disrupted. Entire industries had been destroyed or relocated. The process of economic reconstruction would take decades, and it would be repeatedly interrupted by political crises and renewed conflicts. The technological innovations of the war were now being turned to peaceful purposes. Sometimes, aircraft that had been designed to drop bombs were now carrying passengers and mail. Chemical processes developed for explosives were being used to make fertilizer. Radio technology that had coordinated artillery barrages was now broadcasting entertainment and news. But the most important technological legacy of the war was less visible: the transformation of the state itself. Total war had required total mobilization of society's resources. Governments had taken control of production, distribution, and information on a scale never before imagined. When the war ended, some of these powers were relinquished, but not all. The modern bureaucratic state, with its vast capacity for social control, was born in the trenches of World War I. This expansion of state power would have profound consequences for democracy. Citizens who had been told for 4 years to sacrifice everything for the nation found it difficult to return to the limited government and individual rights of the pre-war era. They had been promised that their sacrifices would create a better world, and they expected their governments to deliver on that promise. When governments failed to provide jobs, housing, and security for returning veterans, people began to look for alternatives. Some turned to socialism or communism. Others embraced fascism. Very few were satisfied with the liberal democracy that had supposedly won the war. The war had also fundamentally altered the role of women in society. Millions of women had worked in factories, driven trucks, served as nurses, and even fought as soldiers. They had proven that they were capable of doing men's work, and many were reluctant to return to their pre-war domestic roles. The suffrage movement, which had been gaining momentum before the war, accelerated rapidly afterward. Women who had sacrificed for their countries demanded the right to vote for the governments that had asked for their sacrifice. By 1920, women had gained the vote in most Western democracies, a political revolution that was directly tied to their wartime contributions. But social change is never smooth or complete. The new woman of the 1920s, independent, educated, politically active, represented only a small fraction of the female population. Most women found themselves caught between traditional expectations and new possibilities, trying to navigate a world that had changed faster than its attitudes about gender roles. The religious impact of the war was equally profound. How could a just God allow such suffering? How could Christian nations slaughter each other with such enthusiasm? These questions shattered the faith of millions and accelerated the secularization of European society. Traditional Christianity, with its emphasis on peace, mercy, and turning the other cheek, seemed inadequate to explain or justify the industrial-scale killing of 1914-1918. New spiritual movements arose to fill the void, some seeking meaning in Eastern religions, others in political ideologies that promised earthly salvation. The war had been sold as a crusade for democracy, freedom, and civilization. When it ended, those values seemed hollow to many who had witnessed what civilized nations were capable of doing to each other. The optimistic faith in progress that had characterized the pre-war era was replaced by cynicism, nihilism, and a desperate search for new sources of meaning. Yet, amid all this destruction and disillusionment, there were also seeds of hope. The League of Nations, despite its ultimate failure, represented humanity's first serious attempt to create a system of international law that could prevent war. The idea that disputes between nations could be resolved through negotiation rather than force was revolutionary, even if it proved premature. The mandate system, for all its flaws, was based on the principle that colonial peoples should eventually be prepared for self-government. This was a significant departure from the older imperial model of permanent domination, and it would eventually evolve into the process of decolonization that would reshape the world in the decades after World War II. Most importantly, the sheer horror of the Great War had created a powerful peace movement. People who had lived through 4 years of unprecedented carnage were determined that it should never happen again. Organizations like the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom worked tirelessly to promote disarmament and international cooperation. But as the 1920s progressed, it became clear that good intentions weren't enough. The problems created by the war were too complex, the grievances too deep, the economic pressures too severe. The peace settlement had created as many problems as it had solved, and the institutions designed to maintain peace were too weak to handle the challenges they faced. In Germany, Adolf Hitler was rebuilding the Nazi Party, appealing to voters who felt betrayed by the democratic politicians who had signed the Treaty of Versailles. In Italy, Mussolini was consolidating his dictatorship and dreaming of a new Roman Empire. In the Soviet Union, Stalin was eliminating his rivals and preparing to transform the USSR into a totalitarian superstate. The veterans of the Great War could see the storm clouds gathering again. They had been promised that their war would be the last one, that their sacrifices had purchased peace for their children. Instead, they watched in horror as their children prepared for an even more terrible conflict. The Great War had ended, but its greatest tragedy was yet to come. The peace treaty signed at Versailles wouldn't create lasting stability. It would create the conditions for an even more devastating war just 20 years later. The boys who had played in the rubble of European cities bombed in 1918 would grow up to fly the bombers that would reduce entire cities to ash in the 1940s. This is the ultimate legacy of World War I. Not just the 16 million who died, but the recognition that modern warfare had become too destructive for civilization to survive. The Great War had shown humanity what it was capable of when it turned its industrial might toward killing. The next war would show what happened when those lessons were learned and improved upon. The silence that fell over Europe on November 11, 1918, wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence before an even greater storm. The world that emerged from the ashes of 1918 was unrecognizable, not just because of the millions of dead or the redrawn borders, but because something fundamental had broken in the machinery of civilization itself. The old certainties were gone. The old rules no longer applied. And in that vacuum, new and terrible forces began to grow. Think about it this way. Imagine you're living in 1919, and everything you thought you knew about progress, about human nature, about the march of civilization, has just been proven catastrophically wrong. For a century, Europeans had believed they were evolving beyond barbarism. Science was advancing, literacy was spreading, international law was developing. Surely rational human beings in the 20th century could solve their disputes without resorting to mass slaughter. Then came 4 years that destroyed that faith forever. The numbers alone were staggering, but numbers can't capture the psychological devastation. This wasn't just death on an industrial scale. It was the death of an entire worldview. The generation that survived had seen their fathers, brothers, and sons fed into a machine that turned human beings into statistics. They had watched poison gas drift across battlefields, turning men into choking, blind animals. They had seen artillery bombardments that lasted for days, reducing entire landscapes to moonscapes of mud and metal. And for what? The Western Front had barely moved. After 4 years of unprecedented carnage, the lines in 1918 were almost exactly where they had been in 1914. Millions had died for a few miles of worthless ground that would be lost and retaken dozens of times. This is where the real tragedy of the Great War lies. Not in the dying, but in the learning. Because humanity did learn from the experience, just not the lessons that the peacemakers at Versailles hoped they would learn. The generals learned that defensive warfare was dominant, so they began developing new offensive weapons, tanks, aircraft, and eventually nuclear weapons, to break through defensive lines. The politicians learned that total war required total control of society, laying the groundwork for the totalitarian states that would dominate the mid-20th century. The scientists learned that chemistry and physics could be weaponized in ways that would make the Great War look like a skirmish. Most ominously, entire populations learned that their governments could demand any sacrifice in the name of national survival, and that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary cruelty when properly motivated. But here's what makes this story even more tragic. The people who recognized these dangers were powerless to stop what was coming. The veterans who had lived through hell tried to warn their societies about the true nature of modern war. Anti-war literature flooded the bookstores. Peace movements organized rallies and petitions. International organizations preached cooperation and disarmament. None of it mattered, because the fundamental problems that had caused the Great War hadn't been solved. They had just been postponed. Germany's humiliation at Versailles created a wound that wouldn't heal. Every time a German worker lost his job, every time inflation wiped out a family's savings, every time Allied troops marched through German cities, the wound was reopened. The Treaty of Versailles hadn't created peace. It had created a 20-year armistice during which Germany could plan its revenge. The collapse of the old empires had created dozens of new countries, but these new states were artificial constructs that satisfied no one. Ethnic Germans found themselves living in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Hungarians were scattered across Romania and Yugoslavia. Millions of people who had never asked to change nationality suddenly found themselves foreigners in their own homes. These weren't just administrative inconveniences. They were human tragedies that created permanent sources of instability. Every minority population was a potential flashpoint. Every disputed border was a future battlefield. Every unfulfilled national aspiration was a recruiting tool for extremist movements. The economic consequences were equally destabilizing. The war had cost more money than all previous wars in human history combined. The victorious Allies owed enormous sums to the United States. Germany owed even more enormous sums to the Allies. Everyone owed money to someone else, creating a web of debt that made economic recovery almost impossible. The reparations system was particularly perverse. Germany was supposed to pay for the entire cost of the war, but they could only earn the foreign currency to make those payments by exporting goods. The problem was that the Allied countries didn't want German exports competing with their own products. They wanted the money, but they didn't want to buy German goods. It was an economic impossibility disguised as a political settlement. When the system inevitably collapsed, it took German democracy down with it. The Weimar Republic, born in defeat and humiliation, never had a chance to establish legitimacy. It was blamed for signing the armistice, blamed for accepting the treaty, blamed for the economic disasters that followed. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, German voters turned to the extremes, communist on the left, Nazi on the right, seeking anyone who promised to restore their nation's pride and prosperity. Meanwhile, the victorious democracies were discovering that winning the war hadn't solved their problems. Britain was financially exhausted and facing rebellion in Ireland, unrest in India, and challenges to its empire around the world. France had won back Alsace-Lorraine, but at the cost of an entire generation of young men. The United States had emerged as the world's dominant economic power, but then retreated into isolationism, abandoning the international institutions that President Wilson had created. The League of Nations, humanity's first attempt at world government, became a talking shop for minor powers, while the major powers pursued their own agendas. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned the action but took no meaningful steps to stop it. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed sanctions that were too weak to matter. When Germany began rearming and expanding in the mid-1930s, the League was powerless to intervene. Each failure made the next one more likely. Aggressor nations learned that international law had no teeth. Democratic leaders learned that their publics had no appetite for another war. Dictators learned that they could pursue their ambitions with impunity as long as they didn't threaten vital interests of the major powers. But the most dangerous lesson of all was learned by a generation of young men who had grown up in the shadow of the Great War. These were the boys who had played with toy soldiers, while real soldiers were dying in the trenches, who had heard stories of heroism and sacrifice from returning veterans, who had been taught that their fathers had fought the war to end all wars, but who could see that the world was sliding toward another conflict. Some of these young men became pacifists, determined never to repeat their fathers' mistakes, but others drew the opposite conclusion. If war was inevitable, they reasoned, then their nations needed to be prepared for it, if the democracies were too weak and divided to maintain peace. Then perhaps democracy itself was the problem. This generation would produce both the greatest heroes and the greatest villains of the 20th century. In the same year, 1889, were born both Adolf Hitler, who would plunge the world into an even more terrible war, and Jawaharlal Nehru, who would lead India to independence through non-violent resistance. The Great War didn't determine which path these men would choose, but it shaped the world in which they made their choices. The technological revolution unleashed by the war was equally double-edged. Aviation, which had progressed from fragile biplanes to capable fighters and bombers during the conflict, now promised to shrink the world through commercial flight, while simultaneously making it more vulnerable to aerial attack. Radio, which had revolutionized military communications, now enabled governments to speak directly to their citizens, a tool that could be used for education or propaganda with equal effectiveness. Chemical weapons, which had horrified the world when first used at Ypres, were banned by international treaty, but continued to be developed in secret. The scientists who had created chlorine and mustard gas didn't stop their research. They simply redirected it toward industrial applications, while maintaining the capability to return to weapons development if needed. Most ominously, the war had demonstrated that the distinction between soldiers and civilians was breaking down. Strategic bombing, submarine warfare, and economic blockade had all targeted non-combatants. The idea that war could be limited to professional armies fighting on distant battlefields had been proven obsolete. Future conflicts would be total wars, in which entire populations would be both participants and targets. The social revolutions unleashed by the war were equally unstable. Women had gained the vote in most democratic countries, but they had not gained equality. The new woman of the 1920s, independent, educated, politically active, represented progress, but she also represented a threat to traditional values that many found disturbing. The backlash against women's rights would become a key component of fascist ideology in the 1930s. The Russian Revolution had created the world's first communist state, providing both inspiration and terror to radicals and conservatives around the world. The Soviet Union under Stalin became a model for other revolutionary movements, while simultaneously serving as a boogeyman that conservative politicians could use to justify repressive measures. The ideological struggle between capitalism and communism that would dominate the second half of the 20th century had its roots in the chaos of 1917-1921. Religious faith, which had sustained previous generations through times of crisis, was another casualty of the war. How could a just God permit such suffering? How could Christian nations slaughter each other with such enthusiasm? The secularization of European society accelerated rapidly after 1918, creating a spiritual vacuum that political movements rushed to fill. Fascism and communism both offered secular religions that promised earthly salvation through political action. They provided the sense of meaning and purpose that traditional religion had once supplied, but they directed that energy toward the worship of the state rather than God. The result was a level of political fanaticism that made the religious wars of earlier centuries look moderate by comparison. The cultural impact of the war was profound and lasting. The generation that fought in the trenches produced a literature of disillusionment that influenced writers and artists for decades. But their warnings about the brutality of modern war were often misunderstood by younger generations who hadn't experienced that brutality firsthand. The lost generation of writers and artists captured the sense of meaninglessness and alienation that followed the war, but their work was often interpreted as sophisticated cynicism rather than traumatic response. Young intellectuals in the 1920s and 1930s read Hemingway and Remarque and thought they were learning about the glamorous despair of modern life, not the genuine of industrial mis-horror, understanding her warfare, this serious political consequences. When fascist movements promised to restore meaning and purpose to national life, they appealed not just to veterans who missed the camaraderie of military service, but to young people who had never experienced the reality of what they were romanticizing. The economic instability of the post-war period created the perfect conditions for political extremism to flourish. The boom and bust cycles that characterized the 1920s and 1930s destroyed the middle classes that had been the foundation of democratic society. Small business owners, skilled workers, and professional people found their savings wiped out by inflation, their livelihoods destroyed by depression, their social status threatened by political upheaval. These people didn't want revolution, they wanted restoration. They wanted to return to an imagined golden age when life was stable, when social hierarchies were clear, when their nations were respected. Fascist movements promised to deliver exactly that, using the language of revolution to promote deeply conservative goals. The tragedy is that the golden age they remembered had never actually existed. The stability of pre-war Europe had been built on a foundation of imperial exploitation, class oppression, and ethnic tension. The Great War hadn't destroyed a perfect world. It had revealed the contradictions and injustices that had always been there. But nostalgia is a powerful political force, and the fascists understood how to harness it. They promised to make Germany great again, to restore the glory of Rome, to create a new empire that would last 1,000 years. They offered simple explanations for complex problems and simple solutions for intractable difficulties. Most dangerously, they offered scapegoats. The problems of the post-war world weren't caused by the inherent contradictions of modern industrial society or the unresolved issues left by the peace settlement. They were caused by traitors, foreigners, racial minorities, political opponents. These enemies could be identified, isolated, and eliminated, restoring the nation to its rightful place in the world. This scapegoating wasn't just politically useful, it was psychologically necessary. The alternative was to admit that the Great War had been a meaningless catastrophe, that millions had died for nothing, that the entire structure of European civilization had been built on false premises. That was too painful for most people to accept. It was easier to believe that the war had been a noble struggle betrayed by internal enemies, that Germany had been stabbed in the back by Jews and communists, that Italy had been cheated of its rightful gains by perfidious allies, that the problems of the present were caused by the malice of identifiable enemies rather than the complexity of historical forces. By the mid-1930s, the post-war order was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The League of Nations was powerless. The democratic governments were paralyzed by economic crisis and political division. The dictators were rearming and expanding, testing the resolve of their opponents and finding it wanting. The men who had fought in the Great War watched this deterioration with growing horror. They could see where it was leading. They had lived through one world war and knew what the next one would bring. But they were old now, tired, outnumbered by younger generations who had learned different lessons from different experiences. The final irony is that the war that was supposed to end all wars had actually made future wars more likely, not less. By demonstrating the devastating power of modern weapons, it had created an arms race. By destroying the old balance of power, it had created instability. By failing to resolve the underlying causes of international conflict, it had ensured that those conflicts would resurface in even more dangerous forms. The Great War hadn't ended in 1918. It had simply paused while the participants regrouped, rearmed, and prepared for the next round. The boys who had watched their fathers march off to fight the war to end all wars would soon be marching off to fight an even more terrible conflict. The peace that had been purchased with 16 million lives would last exactly 20 years and 65 days. This is the true tragedy of World War I, not just what it destroyed, but what it failed to create. The opportunity for genuine peace, for international cooperation, for a world order based on law rather than force. That opportunity existed in 1918. The war had been so horrible, the destruction so complete, that humanity might have chosen a different path. Instead, the victors chose revenge over reconciliation, punishment over rehabilitation, national interest over international cooperation. They sowed the wind and reaped the whirlwind. The Great War became not the war to end all wars, but the first act in a 30-year tragedy that would consume the first half of the 20th century and cast its shadow over all the decades that followed. The silence that descended on Europe on November 11, 1918, carried within it the seeds of everything that would follow. In the immediate aftermath, as church bells rang across the continent and people poured into the streets to celebrate, few could grasp the magnitude of what had just ended. This wasn't just the conclusion of a war, it was the death certificate of an entire world. Picture the scene in any European city that November morning. Crowds gathered in public squares, weeping with relief, embracing strangers, singing patriotic songs. But look closer at their faces. Behind the tears of joy, you'll see something else. A haunted quality, a 1,000-yard stare that had become the signature expression of an entire generation. These people had survived something that human language couldn't adequately describe. The returning soldiers were ghosts walking among the living. They had left as young men full of patriotic fervour, convinced they were embarking on a great adventure that would be over by Christmas. They returned as hollow-eyed veterans who had seen the face of industrial death and could never unsee it. Many couldn't speak about what they had experienced. Others couldn't stop talking about it. All of them were changed in ways that their families and communities couldn't understand. But here's what makes this moment in history so crucial. The world didn't just need to bury its dead and rebuild its cities. It needed to make sense of what had happened. It needed to find meaning in the meaningless slaughter, to extract some lesson that would justify the enormous sacrifice. The problem was that there were as many interpretations of the war's meaning as there were people trying to interpret it. For some, the Great War proved that human nature was fundamentally flawed, that beneath the veneer of civilization lay an animal savagery that no amount of education or progress could eliminate. For others, it demonstrated that the old systems, monarchy, aristocracy, traditional diplomacy, had failed and needed to be replaced with something entirely new. Still, others concluded that the war had been a tragic mistake that could have been avoided if only wiser leaders had been in charge. Each of these interpretations would have political consequences that would echo through the decades to come. The first group would gravitate toward authoritarian solutions that promised to control human nature through force. The second would embrace revolutionary ideologies that promised to create a new kind of human society. The third would support international institutions designed to prevent future wars through negotiation and compromise. But all of these responses shared a common flaw. They assumed that the Great War was an aberration, a temporary breakdown in the normal functioning of civilization. They failed to recognize that the war might have revealed something permanent about the nature of modern industrial society, its capacity for both creation and destruction on an unprecedented scale. The technology that had made the war so devastating didn't disappear when the armistice was signed. The factories that had produced poison gas could just as easily produce pesticides. The aircraft that had dropped bombs could carry passengers. The radio networks that had coordinated artillery barrages could broadcast entertainment. The same industrial capacity that had enabled 4 years of mass killing could be turned toward mass production of consumer goods. This dual nature of modern technology would become one of the defining characteristics of the 20th century. Every scientific advance carried within it the potential for both enormous benefit and enormous harm. The chemists who developed new medicines also developed new weapons. The physicists who unlocked the secrets of atomic structure gave humanity both nuclear power and nuclear weapons. The Great War had been the first demonstration of this terrible duality, but it wouldn't be the last. Future conflicts would push the boundaries even further, developing weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds, delivery systems that could reach any target on Earth, and surveillance technologies that could monitor every citizen's movement and communication. But in 1918, these future horrors were still unimaginable. The immediate challenge was dealing with the aftermath of the war that had just ended. Millions of soldiers needed to be demobilized and reintegrated into civilian society. Millions of refugees needed to be resettled. Millions of war orphans and widows needed care. The physical infrastructure of entire regions needed to be rebuilt from scratch. These weren't just logistical challenges, they were social and psychological ones as well. How do you help a man who has spent 4 years learning to kill adjust to a peacetime job in a factory? How do you integrate women who have run businesses and driven trucks back into traditional domestic roles? How do you teach children who have known nothing but war what normal family life looks like? The answers varied dramatically from country to country, but everywhere the process was painful and incomplete. Veterans struggled with unemployment, alcoholism, and what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Women faced pressure to give up their wartime jobs to returning soldiers, even when they had proven themselves capable of doing the work. Children grew up in broken families, often raised by grandparents or in institutions. These individual tragedies multiplied across entire societies, creating a generation that was profoundly damaged by their wartime experiences. This psychological damage would prove to be as politically significant as the physical destruction of the war itself. Societies filled with traumatized, bitter, and disillusioned people were fertile ground for extremist movements that promised simple solutions to complex problems. The economic consequences of the war were equally destabilizing. The conflict had cost more money than all previous wars in human history combined. National debts had skyrocketed. Currencies had been debased. Trade patterns had been disrupted. Entire industries had been destroyed or relocated. The process of economic reconstruction would take decades, and it would be repeatedly interrupted by financial crises and political upheavals. The reparations system imposed on Germany was particularly destructive. The enormous sums demanded were impossible to pay without destroying the German economy, but any reduction in payments was seen by the Allies as rewarding German aggression. The result was a cycle of economic crisis and political instability that would ultimately destroy German democracy and pave the way for Nazi dictatorship. But Germany wasn't the only country struggling with the economic aftermath of the war. Britain had spent so much money fighting the conflict that it would never again be able to maintain its global empire without American support. France had regained its lost provinces, but at the cost of an entire generation of young men, leaving it demographically weak the United States, which had emerged as seen for decades to come. Even the world's dominant economic power retreated into isolationism rather than accepting the responsibilities that came with its new status. The collapse of the old empires created additional complications. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been replaced by a patchwork of small, weak states that were economically unviable and politically unstable. The Ottoman Empire had been carved up between Britain and France, creating artificial countries that bore no relationship to ethnic or religious realities on the ground. The Russian Empire had been replaced by a communist state that rejected the entire international system and sought to spread revolution worldwide. These new countries faced enormous challenges. They had to create governments from scratch, often without experienced administrators or established institutions. They had to define their national identities while incorporating diverse populations that might not want to belong to the same state. They had to develop economies that could compete in an increasingly integrated global market, while dealing with the disruptions caused by new borders and trade barriers. Many of these challenges proved insurmountable. Czechoslovakia struggled to balance the competing demands of Czechs and Slovaks. Yugoslavia was torn apart by ethnic and religious conflicts between Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians. Poland fought wars with most of its neighbours to establish its borders. Hungary was reduced to a rump state that spent the next 2 decades seeking to recover its lost territories. The mandate system established to govern former Ottoman territories was equally problematic. Britain and France were supposed to prepare these regions for eventual independence, but in practice, they treated them as colonies to be exploited for their own benefit. The arbitrary borders they drew ignored tribal, ethnic, and religious divisions, creating conflicts that persist to this day. And there you have it. 4 years of industrial slaughter, 16 million dead, 4 empires destroyed, the entire map of the world redrawn in blood and mud. But here's the thing that should terrify you about this story. World War I wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. This war didn't solve the problems that caused it. It made them worse. It didn't create lasting peace. It created a 20-year armistice. It didn't end the age of total war. It invented it. Every lesson learned in those trenches, every innovation in killing, every technique for mobilizing entire societies for destruction, all of it would be perfected and unleashed again within a generation. The boys who played in the rubble of bombed European cities in 1918 would grow up to fly the bombers that would reduce entire cities to ash. The peace purchased with 16 million lives would last exactly 20 years and 65 days. The war to end all wars had become the war that made all future wars inevitable. Remember this story, because the silence that fell over Europe on November 11, 1918, wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence before an even greater storm.